Theologian Anne Lamott is quoted as saying, "You can safely assume you've created God in your own image when it turns out that God hates the same people you do." While it seems this psalmist has all the right intent, railing against the persecution of widows and orphans and migrants, people who we continually hear in the Bible to be especially close to God's heart because of their marginalization and vulnerability, we are simultaneously thrown by this poem's focus on vengeance. God is known by many names, but vengeance is not one to which most of us ascribe. But we must remember the Psalms, even more than other books of the Bible, are not God's words to us, but our words to and about God. The Psalms, as I was telling William and Maria, are prayers to God that were possibly sung, perhaps by King David himself. They represent most every feeling that a human being could have, including incredible frustration at the systems in which we live, where it seems that those that God asks us to protect are being harmed. It is clear to us that this psalmist has a particular group at which he is aiming his anger and at which he is asking for God's wrath to be pointed toward. Fortunately, God doesn't work that way. God isn't our puppet, and we are not called to judge others. That being said, we are called to stand up for others and to self-assess our actions. And we can always bring that anger and our frustration to God in prayer. It's amazing how many times people ask me, "Can I tell God I'm mad?" And I tell them, yes, God has big shoulders. God can hear your anger too. In this particular psalm, the psalmist calls out the people called the wicked, a term rarely used anywhere except in Massachusetts, where it doesn't even mean bad anymore. But the psalmist specifically sets his anger on a group which he calls the wicked, those who are prospering on the harm or oppression of others. In the view of this psalmist, and by definition to the rest of us, to be wicked is to do and be the opposite of what God is calling us to be. Wicked, according to our psalmist, is the complete opposite of being righteous. The problem with this word and the view of the people as either good or bad is that it fails to take in account all the gray areas between those 2 points, and it tends to be focused on one particular point in time or one aspect of a person's life. The world is so much messier than that, so much more complicated than that, both when we look at others and when we dare to look at ourselves. Are we judging by individual acts or by a compilation of them? Is there a threshold by which you have now tipped over the edge into irredeemable? Do mitigating circumstances count as they might in a courtroom? Does it matter when in the course of your life the act was done? And all of this before we even consider the even more complicated aspects of wickedness and righteousness. Wickedness based on whose perspective? Like history, does the winner get to decide? Does intent matter? What if we don't even realize that we have done harm? It has taken me a long time to recognize that there are very few villains in the world who purposely set out to do harm. It is nice to focus on these extremes in our conversations because there appears to be no fuzzy lines, and it is easy to see people in the extremes as different from us. The truth is, though, is that much of the harm in the world is done by people, including myself and you, who believe we are doing good, who at some level have justified our actions or lack of actions and simply haven't taken the time or interest in considering the impact we're having on the world around us, or having competing needs which we are more focused on. The psalmist here is venting in the beginning about a group of people who seem to be in the power position, who are making life very difficult and seem to be ignoring the basic tenets of decency and certainly the laws of God. And the psalmist ponders, don't you realize that God sees it all? The psalmist says to those he's accusing, "O dullest of people, when will you be wise?" But this presupposes that the offenders recognize the errors of their way. This presupposes that the harm they are doing is purposeful and premeditated. This presupposes that the perpetrators have insights to the results of their actions. Unfortunately, this so-called wickedness doesn't always present that way, but instead is often disguised in fulfilling our own desires and wants without taking into account the impact on others. It often comes dressed in our comfort rather than someone else's discomfort. Often the only way that we can assess how wicked or bad or harmful an act is to consider our actions from perspectives other than our own, to follow the chain of action or reaction out in time, and to come into relationship with those who are impacted so that we can better see our own actions, even those that we might perceive as good or positive, but might affect others negatively. Theologian Richard Rohr offers us a model through which we might hear the psalmist's cry if we are willing to lean in and listen for it, if we are willing to put our actions to the wicked righteousness test. He speaks of what is called a cosmic egg. It's a series of realms by which we see and understand ourselves. Each realm impacts the other. The original cosmic egg, as you see, has 3 realms to which a 4th gets added. The first realm is a story of you. It is your understanding of yourself, and it is limited to only your perspective of the world, your needs, your desires, your perceptions, how your actions impact you and you alone. The second realm is the story of us. This is us within the communities or groups that we are a part of, as we often understand ourselves based on these connections and are often also formed by our interactions with these communities. The third, and originally the last realm, is the story, the big story, the story that we understand to hold the universal truths by which we guide ourselves. Us, community, universe, all coming together over time to create a cohesive self. That is, we learn that our individual desires sometimes compete with our community's needs, and thus they need to be altered. Or we may call our community into alignment with broader values that we believe should be taken into account along the way. Each level of the story is independent and dependent on the other. And it is in that tension that we find we have work to do so that everything fits just right. Unfortunately, the problem is that sometimes we create harmony in these levels by stopping, looking, and listening to others. We effectively put on blinders so not to as witness the effects that we have on others. Or we just simply find that we have blind spots because we don't come in connection with those others. And we cannot see in those blind spots unless with cause we look. I imagine a cookie jar, which we continuously take from, assuming the jar is there for our convenience and our benefit, and then learning that because we keep taking, someone is continually working to refill the jar, and others are continually without or eating crumbs because the container is empty when they get there. We don't see that, we didn't know, and yet the impact is the same. From our perspective, the jar was there, we were hungry, and the cookies were good. And since they were always there, we assume there's enough for all. Everyone has access to this. But the truth is that injustice has been done, pain is inflicted, and harm exists even though we don't witness it. Thus, Richard Rohr added a fourth realm, the others' stories. He called for us to not only listen for, but to seek out the story of the other. By doing so, he includes this cry from our psalmist in our vision, which in its current form may never have reached the ear of those he is complaining about. It makes it incumbent on individuals and communities to be more mindful of our interconnectedness and how our choices impact others. At the end of the psalm, the psalmist pivots from his anger and adds in an affirmation of who God has been for him. He says, God is my stronghold and my refuge. He says that God has lifted him up when he had felt himself falling, and we wonder if he might have felt himself falling into a place of retribution, of lowering himself to the same place that the offenders are in. He thanks God for lifting him back up and infers that when we try to live into God's teachings, the world is a better place. Part of God's teachings and part of what the psalmist is drawing our attention to here is the care for those that are vulnerable and overlooked. This is what those three categories of people, widow, orphan, and refugee, represent. When we consider this ancient prayer in the current day and in our lives, we should try putting ourselves on both sides of the psalmist's prayer, considering that perhaps the psalmist is condemning us and seeing something in us or in our community to which we belong that might be wicked, and asking ourselves where we might be acting in a way that is causing another harm. In fact, not even trusting that we are right in our own personal assessment, but seeking out a variety of diverse voices to hear about the world around us and how others are being impacted by and through our actions. And simultaneously considering that we might be the psalmist himself, that we might be the ones feeling the hurt and the harm, knowing that we have that right to rage to God, to bring our pain forward, that we have a right to be heard, and that God will stand with us as we voice that pain, and trusting that in the end, all the world and all of us are in God's hands. We do not want to fall, returning pain for pain, wickedness for wickedness, but instead, we want to be steadfast in God's laws, remembering to care for our neighbors as we would for ourselves, especially watching for those less fortunate, the ones called the widow and the orphan and the migrant in our psalm. Let us try to hold up all that we do and all that we participate in into the light of God, asking ourselves continually, is this choice guided by love? Love for our Creator, love for others, and love for creation in general. And as we ask these questions in our heart, let us not simply rely on our own understanding of the world, but also seek out the story of the other, the ones that are often forgotten, overlooked, and left unheard, the people that we may not generally hear from, so that we might see a truer reflection of how we live in this world and what our actions do. By no means will we ever do this perfectly, but we can always do it better. And in the end, as the psalmist is attempting to do, let us remember that we can hand over our frustrations to God, knowing that there is a mystery bigger than we know that can understand our pain, sees the world from a wider perspective, and cares for us all deeply. May we all seek to listen to the unheard stories, finding ways in our life to come into connection with others and remembering that we are part of a bigger story. Amen.